Hello everybody, welcome back to Wainrider Wednesdays, a weekly update for the mod Total War Wainriders that is currently in development for Rome Total War's Alexander expansion. And in this one we're going to take a look at possibly the smallest faction on the map, or at least one of the smallest factions in terms of both geography, number of settlements, and the actual area that they control, and that is the Woodland Realm, the realm of Thranduil. Now that is located, of course, right here in the northeastern part of the Greenwood, or Mirkwood, essentially, by this point. And this is one of the three elven factions in the mod. It is also one of the factions about which we gave sort of a great deal of thought early on in the mod's development. We knew there needed to be several elven factions in the Wainriders period. We knew that there were elves dwelling in this area, as well as in Lorien, as well as in Rivendell and in Lindon. There could be various different ways of dividing those factions up. But it made sense to keep the Woodland Realm its own thing, rather than to group them all together under one, like east of the Misty Mountains, Elven League or something. We decided ultimately that Lorien seemed a better fit for the High Elven faction, given the leadership, given the kinship of those people, given the fact that Lorien did send aid over the Misty Mountains to help Rivendell earlier in the Third Age. So that leaves Thranduil kind of on his own, and for a while there was some thought, at least in my mind, as to whether this should be a faction, given that Thranduil is shockingly inactive during our period, really for the vast majority of the Third Age, or at least the vast majority of it. He exists, right? His kingdom is there in northern Mirkwood, but he really doesn't do anything until the events of The Hobbit, it seems. And so for a while there was some question, should this even be a playable faction? We knew it needed to exist, but what would there be for the faction to do? Well, we thought about it, we discussed it, and I think there will be some interesting challenges and opportunities for the player of the Woodland Realm. But to give you maybe a better sense of that, I thought what I might do this time is just kind of read through the faction intro, which I wrote for the Woodland Realm. I've done this for, I hope, all of the factions in Wainriders, and this might give a sense of the kinds of threats and opportunities we're picturing for the faction before we take a look at them on the campaign map. So, it is the Third Age of the Sun in Middle-earth, but in the deeps of the Great Forest, a gloom gathers. The Elven King Thranduil has been the leader of his people since the War of the Last Alliance at the close of the Last Age, the battle that saw his father Orofair slain, and from which he led back home a host that was scarcely a third of the size of the one that had set out. That war saw the defeat of Sauron, but in the long centuries since, ominous rumors have troubled the borders of the Sylvan folk. Now more than rumor stalks the fringes of the forest. Evil stirs under the eaves in the southern reaches of the wood, whence Orofair removed his people long ago. Cruel people of the Witch King settle at the sources of the great river, and orcs multiply in the caves of the mountains. And to the east, a powerful folk has emerged, slaying or driving before them the free Northmen who once dwelt south of Kelduin. These great movements of peoples have brought war to the kingdoms of men. The vigilance of Gondor has failed. As the Elven King looks out upon a world changed, he must make a choice, merely to defend his ever-shrinking realm, or to risk war once again on his own people's behalf. And so I think that's the way we're sort of imagining Thranduil and the Woodland Realm in general, as a very isolated kingdom, but yet one that is capable, certainly, of getting involved in the troubles of its neighbors. And of course the events of The Hobbit are evidence of that, primary evidence of that. Thranduil is willing enough to send an army out to the Lonely Mountain. But even the events of the War of the Ring, in which Thranduil did play a part, although that was sort of told second or third hand. In the Wainrider period, in terms of the mod, all you need to do is look around northern Mirkwood and to see the number of factions that are actually kind of nearby. We've got the Eotheod on the middle reaches of the Great River, sort of newcomers to the area. They'll be expanding probably north and south of their starting position. You do have the Dwarves of Khazad-dûm. You've got the Western Horde, which is really taking over a large territory here. You've got the League of the North, Dwarves and Men to your east, and you've got, most problematically, I imagine, the Orcs of the Misty Mountains to your north and northwest. You also, though, do have a presence of Angmar. As we saw, Angmar does own some territory to the east of the Misty Mountains, and so you're not really that far from Angmar at all. But to get a better sense of that, let's take a look at the campaign map. And here we are on the northeastern extremity of Mirkwood with the two settlements that began in the possession of the Woodland Realm. As a side note here, a lot of the features of the campaign map are looking quite good in my opinion. We're not going to be changing, too much for no reason, but some things you see should be considered work in progress. For example, resource placement, and in particular up north here, there's just a whole collection of resources that we've set up there just for reference purposes, I guess. But those are going to be moved for the final release. Now, the two settlements you start with are going to correspond essentially to the Elven King's Halls, this settlement right here. We're calling it Belagroth, yes. And that is going to command the crossing of the Forest River, which flows down from the northwest through the forest here. Much of these woods are impassable, by the way. But as you get further east, there are paths to get through them. And that's one feature of Mirkwood that I would like to point out, that there are rather more passages through the forest of Mirkwood, and so I'd like to show that off here today. Our other settlement is just barely outside the eaves of the forest here, Heneb, I guess, the name of that one. And this is going to also command a fairly important position in the northeast. It's not going to exactly dominate the crossing between east and west, but it's going to hold a particularly important point here, because as you can see, just to the northwest, we've got the arid Mithrin Fells. This is in the possession of the Orcish faction. And then to the northeast, the northern bounds in the possession of the rebels at campaign start. To the east of this settlement, though, we've got the northern wildlands, which is going to be essentially Erebor, which we'll get to in a future video. And then the League of the North extends essentially east and south from this point. So you do have a neighbor at the beginning, a couple of neighbors actually, one of which might be considered fairly friendly, a good trading partner, potentially an ally, but they're on neutral footing initially. And then the other, of course, would be an enemy, and that's the Orcish faction, who's going to have some presence in the Grey Mountains nearby. I mentioned also earlier that you would have close proximity to Angmar. They're going to have a settlement right over here, and the Eotheod are going to begin in possession of settlements around here. But as we can sort of see, the passages through Mirkwood have increased since 4th Age Total War. So let's take a look at the marching distance and the sort of routes you might take with your armies through the forest. Now again, names are going to be changed. We haven't taken a pass through the elven names yet, so we've got sort of hobbitish names here, just as a holdover from 4th Age. We'll just click on this guy, and we'll see how you can move. Basically, the only passage that would be possible to the north would lead you through your capital, through the Elven King's Halls, then up towards this settlement here. But let's take a look at the more interesting route down to the south. We'll take a few turns and see where this passage is going to go. So having moved down from our capital, we're on what would essentially be, is this the old forest road, essentially, that the hobbits took, or that the Hobbit took, Bilbo, with the dwarves on his trip to the Lonely Mountain. Now, in 4th Age Total War, we did have this passage, but really nothing else. It would lead you to the Elven King's Halls, but there was no turning south from it. In this mod, though, in Wainriders, that is a little bit different. For example, we could set a passage that would lead you down into this settlement. So let's just go ahead, we'll do that, and then we'll see what can happen after that. So now, having occupied this settlement here, Emin Nu Fuin, you can see that we have quite a bit of options here. In 4th Age Total War, there was a settlement pretty much right around here, where you would be able to access it from the forest road, but there was no going south beyond that point. In Wainriders, however, there are a couple of passages leading to the south. One southwest, to the old forest road, I guess it would be, and then the other to the southeast similarly. But it's going to lead you through some rough terrain. These are the mountains of Mirkwood, essentially. And so there is going to be a bit more north-south communication in Wainriders, and I felt that that was very important to do for especially the Elven, the Woodland Realm faction, because in 4th Age Total War, you may note that a lot of the movement of the elves in Mirkwood had to be around the fringes of the forest. You could move east and west at a couple of points here and here, but those were separate from one another. In Wainriders, however, there is going to be that north-south movement, so you can just move a little more easily without having to trespass on territory to the east or west of the forest. Down into the south of Mirkwood, of course, there is that gap leading from the East Bight over towards the Anduin Vale, and that is going to be a passage that is open. And I think that's it in terms of passages through the forest, but we just have a little more permeability, so Mirkwood is not quite so solid of a border. Without having like a ton of passages gratuitously, we've got just a few more options for you. And I think that's important because Mirkwood was something of a barrier, but at the same time, there were passages of Easterlings and Wainriders through the forest. We hear that they were leading raids on the Anduin Vales, the Ayothiad, at various points in their history. And although those raids seem not to have touched the elves, that's because, lore-wise, Thranduil was largely confined north of the Forest River here. He didn't really do anything at all during the Wainrider period. And so what you will have to do as the Woodland Realm is, of course, hold on to that territory, but then most likely expand south, taking some of these rebel territories and also possibly securing your northern frontiers against those hostile orcs and maybe your southeastern fringes against whatever other hostile men might move into the territory. So it is going to be a little bit of an unusual campaign. You're a very small faction, a very isolated faction, and a lot of your units, as you may know or would be able to predict, are going to be very good in the forest on ambush. So you're going to be a very good defensive faction within your home territory. And probably a lot of your initial fighting is going to take place in the forest here. So it's going to be pretty solid advantage in your court. However, as you expand out, as you secure some of those fringe territories, you may have a harder time of it, especially if you're talking about getting into the mountains, dealing with orcs, dealing with Angmar. And a lot of it will probably depend on how successful Angmar is in the west. If they can quickly dominate and take over the majority of Eriador and then turn their attention towards you, then you may be very hard put to it indeed. It would be wise to sort of help out your friends, the High Elves. Well, I say friends, but Thranduil certainly seemed to wall himself off from them, or at least his father. We hear that Orofair, I think, initially held territory right around Dol Guldur before it was Dol Guldur, but then moved north through Mirkwood in a few successive phases with the encroachment of elves around Lorien, and also the dwarves, I believe, impacted his desire to move away from all of that. But of course, the War of the Last Alliance was the last time that woodland elves would play a role in geopolitics of Middle-earth, at least until the Battle of the Five Armies. So Thranduil, we know, is capable of getting himself involved on the wider stage, and it'll be interesting to see how successful you can make him. For my money, the goal will certainly be to command northern Mirkwood at least, and then see what I might do around the fringes, right? See if I can take out some of those orcish realms, maybe secure the upper stretches of the Anduin, and then think about heading south and east. I'd love to, just as I mentioned with the Avari preview, command the wine trade, essentially. Get down to Dorwinian, because we know that the Elven King is very fond of his Dorwinian wine. And so if we could secure that trade route, that's something I'm definitely going to be aiming to do. Possibly even capturing some territories around the Sea of Rune. We've got some nice forested regions around here. It seems fitting. But this is going to be a bit of a niche faction, I guess. In the end, you know, they're very important to have in the mod because it wouldn't really be the same without them, right? We couldn't just put rebels in here. And Thranduil is a known character, so there's really no option in terms of leaving them completely out. But I think they'll make an interesting, if a bit of a slow burn of a campaign, and probably one of the more challenging ones, actually. At least if you want to play in a lore-friendly manner. You probably would have an easier time if you just attacked the dwarves and the men of the League of the North and secured a strong position up here north of the Kelduin. That would be a pretty defensible position, I would think, and probably fairly wealthy. But at any rate, I hope you enjoyed this look at the Woodland Realm, one of the smallest factions in the mod, both in terms of their geographical territory and in terms of number of settlements. So I'm interested to see what you think about them. And in the next Wainrider Wednesday, we'll probably be going back west or south a little bit to take a look at one of the other factions that we haven't examined more closely. So stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, everybody, take care.